So Corey is partially correct that I probably would be classified as unorthodox in the class context. That means you're going to participate whether you like it or not. There's just not really a question about it. But I'll set some ground rules for that participation. There actually is some level of standarding. Number one, I will say this: I don't know everything. I have climbed to the summit of my ignorance and seen that it's a vast field of my potential new things to learn that surround us. That's something I think is super important for all of us to get a hold of, is that we are infinitesimally small and surrounded by brilliant lights of ideas in every space that might be near us or far, and take the journey to get from wherever you're at to there. And so that part of that's going to be in this class time, but also through the course of the week and beyond. Secondly, sometimes I say things using words that you may not have heard before. That's not your fault, it's my fault. I grew up in a home that had a bunch of encyclopedias, no internet, and I was bored. And so my vocabulary is dangerously dumb. There are words that aren't used in English anymore that just kind of pop up. And so I apologize if I say something, you're like, what is that? Feel free to do one of two things. You can either write it down and come to me afterwards and say, hey, you said that, what is that? That's totally awesome. Or you can write it down, and I'll give you my wife's cell phone number, and you can text it to her. And you guys can join the help club. There's a little kind of a special meeting they have once a week. It includes my own children and a few others, and you'll join the crew that way. And you can say, he said this, but we're not sure that's a word. Well, that'll happen too. And so you can just kind of get accustomed to that reality. This morning, we're going to start off in a series of 8 lessons. We'll put all the fun stuff away for now. We'll unbox it a few more times later. Certainly some mockery and some shame will take place. But let's start thinking about things. When you think about the idea of family, if you are existing in our current cultural construct, the place where we see the relationships around us and we think about them, you immediately have an idea of what that is. Your idea may be exactly mimicking whatever it is that creation tells us. But it's going to be coming with baggage that comes from your experiences. I will say that my home experience growing up has a lot of wonderful aspects to it. But like many of you, I would have been classified as part of a blended family. I have 2 step siblings and all of the stress that comes from figuring that out. And it was not an easy process to figure that out, especially as the youngest sibling in that arrangement. I have family that cares about me deeply. But we often don't see eye to eye about lots of stuff, from small things to spiritual things. And so family for me also includes figuring that part out, and we'll talk about that some as well. When we talk about our kind of thematic idea that we've used as both a title and a concept, we're thinking about it in terms of returning to a point of stability that is trying to teach us some things we don't already know. And so if you have your ignorance there, and I include mine, and you know there's some stuff that you might gain from going back to an earlier version of things, we're going to start with that concept. But I want you to try to do your very best to do this. When you are reading or thinking about the stories of creation, and there's a few small stories inside that big story, realize that you're getting a window into not just physical things, but you're actually kind of stepping into a space that is intermediary between physical and ethereal or spiritual. The reason I say that is the garden picture that we often kind of have our eyes on really small and close. We've used our little pinch to zoom feature in our brain, and we've gotten real close to it, is only a little tip of what's going on there, because the garden really is a representation of what we would call a temple, or if you want to use a more modern vernacular, a chapel, because it is the place in which man and God interact. And so our garden narrative, where creation is unfolded to us, is the first chance we get to see humanity, either in singularity or in plurality, truly interacting with God. And then it repeats itself. It repeats itself visually in an image basis as the tabernacle. Man and God interact there again. And then in the temple. And then it becomes the foundation that it's used by the Son of God in the way he's presented to us in the New Testament as the next opportunity in the church to interact between God and man. And here's the capstone of it. This is the cycle you're hearing. That's probably too much. We go back to the garden in the end. The last closing refrains of Revelation say, we're going to go back to a relationship that's very similar to what we see there. Similar doesn't mean the same. It's not a blueprint or a copy repeat. It's similar. So having that kind of a point of saying, okay, we're seeing something in this relationship of man and woman and God that's not just physical, organic, biomatter. It's actually trying to get us some threading to relationships that step past this physical plane into, and we'll use biblical terms, the heavenly realm, heavenly spaces, heaven. Now that has two uses in the Bible. Heaven is both a physical construct of the blue sky above, but it's also a spiritual concept of a place beyond our recognition. So it's trying to see it, have a see there. So when we start thinking about that with that idea, and how creation then takes place inside a divine space, because it does, what then that should tell us about families? Are families organic constructs that are similar to, the way in which lemurs interact? Is a lemur family the same as a human family? I mean, lemurs are cool, by the way. I don't know if you know this, but they're super awesome, right? So everyone's shaking their heads and saying, no, it's not the same. How is it not the same? How is the human family not the same as lemur or insert other family unit of creation that you particularly prefer?
Well, we know, we know we're created in God's image, so that sets us apart, obviously. But also, we have God's law to follow. We have a divine law that God reveals to us that we are to follow. The animals do not have the same thing.
Right. There's something about humanity that is inclusive in this concept of imaging. And so what it means to be made within the image, plural terms are being used there, starts shifting our perspective. The idea of being made in the image of God has some tendrils that are important for us to calculate, because here's the thing. In the New Testament, when Paul brings this subject back into play, he says this imaging of the divine influences how you treat every single person you meet. How many of you love Chick-fil-A? This is a question that's only one answer, right? You either love Chick-fil-A or you haven't been there yet. That's the way it works. And I say that because I live right now, I could get to the headquarters of Chick-fil-A Central in like 20 minutes. And so I'm contractually bound as a Sharpsburg resident to also say that. But that's the way it works. And why do we like it? Is it because the chicken is great? We think that's the case. But if you take the chicken out of Chick-fil-A and put it in any other restaurant, it tastes like chicken. They actually get all their stuff from the same suppliers. They use all the same suppliers that Popeye's chicken uses, that Guthrie's uses, that Slim Chickens uses. Cane's probably has the best sauce, by the way. Etc. It's the same chickens. They're all from the same plants. They might have a slightly different amount of MSG. And Chick-fil-A, by the way, uses the most MSG. There's nothing wrong with monosodium glutamate. That's a separate thing. But it's chicken. So do we like it because of the chicken or something else? I will argue we like it because they treat you as a human being. They give you a name. They are trained. All my kids have actually worked at Chick-fil-A, so I know this takes place. They're trained how to interact with you. And part of that training is they teach their employees when you arrive in the place that you have a story you don't know. And so when they see a single person sitting at the table by themselves and they're there once a week, every week, they remind them that that person could be someone whose spouse just passed. That person could be someone whose heart is just broken. They could be struggling at school or at work. And so when you serve them, you're not serving them chicken. You are, but you're serving them. And so they train their employees to think about people as people. Even when there might be some strong differences across the board, they're still people. And so the reason that we end up liking going to Chick-fil-A is that the standard of human interaction is higher because they see people as people. Paul does that when he talks about a relationship to our brethren. He says, remember, you are made, you are fashioned and formed as someone who possesses a divine image with all of the quirks and uniquities that make you you. That's special. In modern cultural terms, it means you have value and worth, and your worth is substantial. And it supersedes the, 90-some-odd% water mass that you are, and the 10-ish% minerals and other stuff that make up you. It supersedes that. And we think partially from this event that that's the case. And by the way, it's not just the way in which humanity engages in this way. There's an even closer network of relationships that's being shown here. Because in creation, in this moment here, these divine image bearers are attached together because of their differences as they support one another. And it narrows in this relationship to the marital core. But there's actually something going on there. Because you'll notice in the language, if you read back through Genesis 2, man individually, Adam, made of dirt individually, doesn't yet rise completely to what it means to be made in the image of God. There's a component of otherness that's necessary before they, plurality, can be then seen as being made in the image of God. And he doesn't go into great detail. This is what the Bible does all the time. It tells us a great thing, and then says, that's all you get. You get the mystery underneath, and you got to chew on it for a while. Think about it, and use the intellect that God has given you to grapple through it. And so when we think about the larger narrative that's taking place in Genesis 4 through 24, it's leading us to an in-depth perspective that says there's something being made here that's going to be useful and forming our perception of everything else afterwards, so much so that it is a reoccurring construct, the story of creation, and the way in which God's people tell other people about what heaven is like. Here's a out of the context of our specific lesson series bonus thought for you. How many of you love the Sermon on the Mount? This is also an answer. There's only one possible one here, right? Contractually obligated to my obligations to Jehovah to say yes, the answer is I love the Sermon on the Mount. But I want you to think about this. The Sermon on the Mount, as it calls us into this kingdom, is calling us to a kind of kingdom that is otherworldly. It's saying you need to live in a heavenly world that's already been there. You're actually going back to it. And he uses a lot of the imagery that comes all the way back from the beginning of the garden, the picture of humanity in its pre-fall state. But you will be redeemed, transformed, and renewed in that regard. Now, I say all of that to maybe make a connection about the way in which we think about the relationship first of man and woman that becomes the central core, if you will, of this family unit that's being built there. But I'm going to do that by paying attention to the way humanity, sometimes even out of the divine constructs, thinks about the rest of humanity. And so some of you will know exactly who this artist is, and you'll see these lyrics and you go, I know all the things. Some of you are like, I don't know who this is. It's fine. It's going to all get spelled out for you. But there is a modern pop artist. One of your poets has said, as if you want to use Pauline's speech, this terminology. So one of our poets has said, when I found a woman stronger than anyone I know, she shares my dreams. I hope that someday I'll share her home. I found a lover to carry more than just my secrets, to carry my love, to carry children of our own. Poets are wonderful. American poets are all over the board with stuff. But you begin to see in someone who may not otherwise have deep spiritual convictions at all. And I don't really know Ed Sheeran's true ideology regarding heaven, regarding humanity. But I can read within this and say, he certainly seems to catch the essence of a relationship that tight and that close, doesn't he? And if you've heard the song, I apologize now, it's ringing through your head, and that's on you, it's not on me. Okay, yes, it's on me. But I want you to think about that in regards to the next time you read through Genesis and the creation account, and the way in which God frames the one who was insufficient. There's no helpmeet for me. There's nobody suitable for me. And now you have an individual who most likely is well outside of a deep spiritual connection, now writing about a connection that certainly has deep tendrils of that spiritual draw of, hey, this person actually fits me. And this is independent of our chewing on the nature of creation and the process of it. This is talking about the relational aspects of it. And so in the relationship aspect of being made in the image of God, it requires two parts. Male and female is the design blueprint in that regard, and that relationship then has them being suited to one another in all the facets and forms. One author once wrote it this way. He says, you think about your relationship to your beloved as this. You're different for a purpose, because if both of you were exactly the same, then one of you would not be necessary. And that's really something that's valuable to catch on to early in those things rather than later. So that romantic love, which is the ethos of most poetry in this genre, then echoes the constructual relationship between two individuals crafted by God and then told, you are now bearers of this, whatever it means to be in the divine image of God. And so that means male and female, somehow fits in there, but also relationally they fit together. That's part of the blueprint. This is the foundational aspect of how this relationship functions. This is not like marriage 101, this is relational 101. Because you'll figure out that that relationship model actually helps us figure out all the other relationships that orbit around us. And if that model is healthy, it's a lot easier to figure out the tendrils that surround it. And so there you go back into thinking about the text, and we hone in foremost into verses 4 through 14. And so we've read ourselves into it starting in verse 18 to 24, and we've done the whole Sherlock thing, and so we got to the end of the matter quickly, or the Paul Harvey, and we're going to begin at the end, but now we're going to back up and figure out what's going on. In Genesis chapter 2, in verses 4 through 14, we get the introduction of an idea of the very first home. This home relationship, these two that are going to become one. The first fellow we meet is Adam. Adam, or made of dirt, that's kind of what his name implies or indicates. It's the Hebrew idiom bringing up into our English. He is shown to be a worker. That's like his primary interactions with everything around there. And we think of him, by the way, what do we think of Adam's primary job? If we're going to give him a title, what's his work title? He is a gardener, right? So let's do a little garden linking to get our brain together. When the women go to the tomb and they show up there and they see a guy around, what do they mistake him for?
Gardener.
As a gardener. And what did Paul call the original gardener? That's the first Adam. And who's the last Adam? The one who was misunderstood as being a gardener. That's a link to let your brain remember these stories are interlinked. If you want the technical fancy term, this is the one for the dictionary. It's intertextuality. But that links to this. And so it's a hyperlink between the stories. Help you remember, hey, there's a gardener then. And then Jesus is literally a great gardener, and he's mistaken for a gardener. Oh, and by the way, a gardener doesn't just tend the soil. They have jobs, especially in antiquity, that are equivalent to what we would also call, wait for it, the carpenter. It was also the job that Jesus had. And so there's a great link of Adam the worker, who is the gardener, who would have been equivalent to a carpenter, who becomes the archetype of our idea of the world around us. And his first job is tending and taking care of everything and maintaining or stewarding this creation. And you begin to kind of see that this beautiful garden space, which is a chapel, Adam's job is to take care of things, manage the space. That informs us as part of whatever it means to be made in the image of God, and whatever it then also would then mean to be part of a marital relationship, is that there's a realm of service that is in primacy. That's that worker space. Now keep in mind, the suitable helpmate also is a worker, but there's a role edge that kind of falls off there and picks up in another space. Because Adam is not only a worker, he's a tenant. He doesn't own the space. And that's a challenge for most of us to think through. Let's tie back into our earlier comment of the Sermon on the Mount, and also the additional gospel echoes of how Jesus is teaching us to think about stuff. How many here can right now tell me the story of Jesus talking about building another barn? Corey, can you tell me that story? This is the unorthodox part where he's being forced to work.
So he said, I'm going to just tear down my barn to
Yeah.
build a greater, to store all my things, and you may not live long enough to see it. Short story.
Yeah, the short story is, hey man, you better make sure you, in essence, we use this vernacular. You got to count that cost. You got to think it through because you don't know what tomorrow is like. How many of you, and this is going to generationally stratify you, thought that when you got a job somewhere, where you started is you get your pension and you retire there? How many of you guys thought that that's the way things work? As a kid, that's how I thought it worked. That's how my dad worked. And he got into chemical sales, he worked, the company name changed, but they kept getting bought and like reorganized. And so he started with Coral, then Parker, then Henkel, then Amchem, but it was the same job. And he retired with a pension. That's how, and my grandfather was the same way. He worked at the mine, started as a laborer and became a foreman, retired on his pension. That's what you did. We have this illusion that that's security. How many people you know, those who maybe even have experienced this, were laid off from those jobs? How many of you had to lay people off? My first corporate level job was retention and firing for a corporation on the West Coast. So I would go in, spy out the land, see the lazy lackards, go back to the office, write out my report, take off my plain clothes, put on my official uniform clothes, and go back in and fire people. Because it's an illusion of security that we create for ourselves. And that illusion even goes to the very core of things. Because in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is angling us to pray that we get our daily bread, he's trying to help us understand that no matter how our level of savings are, our equity stake in our businesses, it doesn't matter. All of that is actually a result of God providing us a place to live as a tenant or renters. Now, we want to be good renters, but in the end, all that can be taken away. And even if it is, God still is going to bless us with sufficiency. He's going to give us enough. In fact, a gracious God actually always gives us more than we ask for. And always gives us the thing we need independent of what we ask for. So weird. But that's what we're seeing in the garden. Adam the worker is also Adam the tenant. And you and I, who are crafted in the image of mankind, are also the worker and the tenant to this day. How many of you know someone who lost everything personally and yet still found a way to move forward? I know lots of them. You think about it. Like I know close friends who had every single thing taken away from them. They lost all their possessions in fire. Recently, I had a buddy of mine, an entire work operation, the barn and stuff. They held all of their implements for their entire business burn up. They barely saved like a couple tractors and a mulcher, and the edge of the house is gone too. Fantastic people, but they're going to have to rebuild that, and they're going to be okay. You start thinking about that more deeply and more succinctly, you begin to see that, hey, there's something in me that I've got to pay attention to, because I'm part of this blueprint process going forward, that's appearing in this tenant-worker model. Text continues. This is the next part of Genesis, in verses 16 and 17. And we'll read this one here. And let's see, who am I going to volunteer to read this? Ryan's going to read it for me because he raised his hand. He was willing sacrifice. So just read verses 16 and 17 for me.
And the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat of any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die."
How many of you, and this is me telling on myself, when somebody tells you you can't do a thing, it instantly wants you to make you do the thing? Like, I'm 100% that way. I'm obstinate. I'm troublesome. If you say, you shouldn't eat that, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to eat all of that. You can't do that. I'm going to do two of those things. That's a human behavior. It's a consequence of the fall to a certain degree, but I think it's part of our willpower set that's unchecked. And discipline is necessary for us to override those inputs, but first covenant is basically one of those things. Hey, you can do whatever you want in this realm, except this thing. And he's fairly successful about it for an unknown amount of time. The Bible actually doesn't tell us the length of time he had on that wall. We've had 7,412 days without an accident. There's some amount of time between this and that. And it doesn't say how long he kept a safety-free workplace. Because, I mean, that's where he works. And he kept up his end of the bargain. But over time, this covenant then becomes saturated with opportunity. And I'll say this right here. If you think about the story of the fall, which is included in this, make sure that you equally identify the blamed parties. This is not an Adam alone thing, nor is it, oh, Eve. Eve's so awful. Like, they're both dumb. That's because we're all dumb. Like, they're just we are mimicking them as a result after that. Because Adam certainly could have interjected, didn't. Eve could have interjected at some points also and didn't. They communally were failing, and the consequences were also spread evenly to the two of them as well. That covenant then starts to help us understand that the nature of relationship between creation and creator is causal. There's going to be some commitment and connection to that which has created us. And it manifests later in a couple of ways. Part of it's contractual. If, then that. That's super contractual. But it is designed to actually supersede the contractual relationship. The Bible shows us in the story of Israel that God promised great grace to Israel. The great grace first manifested in a land full of great abundance. This is a question that Corey can't answer because I've already picked on him once. I still have to figure out who my next victim is. But when the spies go out into the land, what is the symbolic representation of how great the blessing is when those spies come back? Grapes, right? How big are those grapes in the way that they're written to us? A 2-man load of grapes. Now, as a younger Bible reader, when we see grapes that big in our mind, we tend to do the wrong thing. We make the grapes huge. It's like, it's Willy Wonka, man. These grapes are the size of people. But the way that the imagery is being used there is that grapes that would normally just have a few on the vine start looking so overloaded that you can't carry them yourself. And there's all the way from top to the bottom, full. And just, if you've ever tried to raise grapes, if you tried to be a vine tender, I've both succeeded and failed in that task, and mostly failed. You begin to realize, hey, wait, that's not easy. There's a lot of work involved in that and trying to tend that particular type of produce. But what was being shown there is God has blessed the land in such a way that his blessing causes it to behave in otherworldly ways. They shouldn't grow like that. And so they come back and they say, it's so abundant. And by the way, if you go to Israel today and you see the Ministry of Tourism and Industry and Commerce, their symbols are all full of massive stacks of grapes. That's how they represent their abundance still. And so you have this image of them coming back that we've never seen that before. Land can't do that. That's super important because the land that they had come from was identified as being incredibly fertile. Great soil. It's beautiful. And you can grow anything there. We sent cotton over to Egypt, and now they're the king of cotton. So it grows over there in great quantity and abundance because it's great soil. But in Israel, where it's not great soil, by the way, great abundance. And so the contractual basis of this covenant is I'm going to keep a blessing for you. And it's going to be great. But if you notice that God not only always keeps his commitment to grace in that regard, but even when they fail to keep the covenant, God often extends his willingness to keep his end beyond our earthly levels of willing to honor a contract. Additional grace, additional abundance, concern, blessing the land even when they are completely reprobate in their behavior, and they're still blessed. But our PowerPoint for right now is to see that kind of relational thing. Remember, this is being taught to us not through the lens of future Israel. It's being taught to us in the close familial intimacy of two people in the sight of God. And so if you want a good representation of what grace can look like and should look like, even under a covenant, I do, that's the covenant. You made a covenant when you got married. Grace is found in its deepest well of potential right there. And so this first covenant then informs us that families should then be great in grace. And God, in his illustration, has been great in grace to all. That leads us, and see, I remember the clock timing is supposed to be 10:10, 10:15. Yeah, that's great. It's good that it's consistent because that's the same thing back home, so my brain will be able to function properly. These verses we've already kind of read, verses 18 through 24, shower with us the potential to rethink how humanity is then envisioned. There's all kinds of bad jokes that we tell each other about this biblical story, but I want to make a really strong plea. This is going to set the stage for a few other conversations during the week. There's a culture of comedy that exists that you make fun of your spouse. Like they're your comedic foil, if you will. I'm not a big fan of that. Here's the two reasons why. If you love your wife sufficient to really commit to that marriage, then why are you using them as a dumpster in all of the facets of your relationship? The Bible actually shows that you should be, and this is for the men's side first, they should be a queen, honored, cherished, and raised. And so you change your behavior, gentlemen, and then the same thing is true on the other side. I've heard women over the years just completely destroy the nature of the husband because they don't fold the clothes the way they wanted, or they didn't do the job what they wanted, or they're not as successful financially as they wish they were. That's all of us. There's no value in tearing apart the thing that you cherish. And so this blueprint right here is trying to actually remind us that we are intertwined from creation. And so when you pull those scabs off of your spouse and re-expose those scars, you're actually doing it to yourself. That's the hardest thing to capture when you're young and newly married, by the way. But you really are becoming one. Yes, sir?
Where does respect come into what you're saying?
It's going to be coming, not just, I think it's probably the outgrowth of these things. If you understand the value of the person you've bonded together with, then by consequence, you respect them. And that respect goes not just into your speech, but here's the next step of it. And we'll talk about this 2 times this week when we talk about Proverbs 31 and Job 31. This is my enticement for you to come back. Is that kind of respect exceeds earthly expectations of, well, you said the right words and you were present at the right things, but you respect them at an innate level, an intrinsic level. I not only care about what I say, but I actually want to know how they feel and how my behavior makes them feel. And respect then is the outgrowth of that perspective. But to even deepen the question, it's really because I respect the Creator. I respect people made in the image of God because God made them, just like He made me. And so while we've narrowed it into the marital space, we've now realized that that's actually how we treat everybody. Even if they have an entirely different worldview, even if they have no knowledge of God, it does not give me the right to treat them as a dog. And in fact, we should actually elevate them to the highest level. Yes?
Well, isn't that what we're learning? Respect and obedience from reading this.
Yeah, the outcome of all reading should be that the reading we do is thoughtful in the sense of, hey, I should actually apply this. It's not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. It's the knowledge that this knowledge then empowers me to see the world differently. But without that knowledge, then we get stuck in our ruts. Oh, this is how it is. Marriage is this way. Relationships are this way. Context is this way. We're really trying to shift our perspective off of earthly constructs of what family is like to capture the heavenly ethos, the meaning of what a family is like. Because the world around us is going to constantly change. So we're going to need this unified structure of a family construct pulled out of, and here's some things that we've already identified, pulled out of our, maybe you're like me and you have a mixture of 50s and 70s ideals regarding what marriage is. That's my generation. We got a mix of those things because those were our parents and grandparents. Maybe you're in a world that's more young and you have 70s and 90s grandparents and parents. Remember, they're all trying to do the right thing, but they're kind of a lesser impression of the biblical text. And so every time we go back to the scriptures, we're trying to toss aside all of our I thinks, I mights, it could be, and layer it into this is what God wants it to be. And that may mean challenges for me. Maybe my own personal choices have made my life a mess to this point. And we're going to look at some messy people in the Bible. Two of them are unlikely illustrations of God's grace and goodness. And so we're going to see some of that. We'll see that in our reading through Proverbs and our reading through Job. And we'll see it in application spaces in our other lessons as well. But we're going to kind of capture that reality and say, okay, now that this is how it is, I was made in the image of God, and I'm a bit broken because of my choices. How does God reform me to then move the arc of my existence closer to the arc of God's plan? Because the rest of the world around us is going to keep pulling at it. It's going to try to make us less. It's trying to break our confidence in who we are and whom God is. It's going to try to insidiously worm its way into our thought processes like a little worm and ruin whatever holiness we're trying to build within us. And reading the Bible, and I'll mention this probably way too much, becoming careful readers of the Bible is incredibly essential. Here's the illustration for that. How many of you have played the game Telephone, where you pass the little noises around? Do you realize that if you're not a careful reader of the Bible, you're playing telephone with yourself? How many little details have you missed because you read too fast? So like this is part of the concept of getting this blueprint right, is learning to slow down, carefully examine the scriptures, remind yourself of things that man and woman are created as equal image bearers, not one lesser, one greater, who then diversify their talents into the roles that surround them, and it is seen as a holy union. It's a sanctified space. And I say that not just because of consequential practices, but a recognition of where it takes place. The primary marriage, for all humanity's echoing, takes place in the temple of God, where God himself is present. Not just in the spiritual structure, but he is physically present at their wedding. And it is only after their rebellion that they're uncomfortable with God being there. That should certainly adjust our expectations. And I got two thought questions. These are like those, take it and like write it down, talk over lunch or in between class, or just even to think about deeply. What are you doing right now to better reflect the design of humanity and family daily? What small things are you doing or big things? Because there's something you can do, even if you're already hitting on like 7 of 8 cylinders, or 11 of 12 if you're in a race car or a tractor. There's some things you can actually tweak to better amplify your image-bearing status. And secondly, internally in the family, what can you do to strengthen those relationships? I have some answers, and we'll talk about some of them this week. But you know what's really awesome is when you think about how you can find answers for your family. Because as I've already kind of partially explained, my family's got some baggage and some weirdness on my side. Jill's side is awesome. I mean, I'm sure there's baggage there, but I'm unaware of it. And, you know, you've had those contexts of, this is what I know, and so I'm working on this. Well, I don't all know your lives. You do. And you can figure out a spot where things could get better. And figure that out. Talk about it at lunch. And this is a really hard thing. When it gets talked about, and this is a real struggle for me, shut up and listen. Because somebody may be telling you something quietly, that you need to hear. And it'll be hard to hear it because you'll figure out that you're the actual problem. And most of the time you are, because most of the time I am. The clock says this is officially where we have to stop, but this is like a pause because we'll come back and do other things later. As I mentioned before, if you've got questions about things that I've said, if you would like clarification, extra insight, I'm more than happy to share that time with you, and you can tell me why I'm wrong, and I probably am.